Hello. Today's video is all about chores, especially focusing on childhood chores. And this video is also a plug for the ebook that I wrote that is called The Old-Fashioned Approach to Childhood Chores. The ebook is available on my website and I will link that. But today we're going to talk about the chores here on the homestead. And I'm going to show you clips of the children doing some of their chores. And I'm also going to answer some questions that I get. I won't have time to answer all the questions that I received on Instagram, but I'm going to try and answer the most commonly asked questions. So, a little backstory. Most of you know, but some of you might not, that my husband and I were both raised in Old Order Mennonite families. So the Old Order Mennonites are the horse and buggy Mennonites. And we were part of that culture until we were 27 years old. The Mennonites and the Amish are very, very productive people and are probably some of the most functional and hardworking communities in America. So when you see our children doing chores, that is very much the same way my husband and I were raised on the farms in our families. So this is not a new experiment for us. Our children are doing chores just the way that my husband and I did when we were children. We had to get up and do chores before we went to school as well. So for some of you, that may seem like a drastic life change to have your children get up at 6:15 and do an hour's worth of chores before they can get themselves ready for school. It wasn't a drastic life change for us. That's the way we were raised. And so it just seems natural for us to raise our children that way. Our children have always experienced us getting up and doing chores before we do other things around the homestead. So it's not new to them either. The first thing we do when we get up is go take care of the animals. So that's a little backstory, letting you know that this is not a new way of life for us. This is the way that we were raised. It's probably the way our parents and grandparents were raised as well. So I'm going to dive into answering some of the questions, and I'm going to show some clips of our children doing chores. So first of all, let me start by addressing a comment that children should never be forced to do chores and that they would choose to do chores when they are ready. This is not the nature of the children in our home. And the chores that we give our children aren't necessarily just for my benefit. They aren't just to lighten my workload or my husband's workload, although that's a great reason for them to do chores. But the main reason that our children have chores is because they are learning life skills. We are not just checking things off of a list and now they are done. This is a way for our children to learn a life skill. The number one life skill that we want for them to learn through childhood chores is self-discipline. I can do things that I don't want to do because it means that then I get to do things that I want to do. So the self-discipline to say, I can do things that aren't fun and that I don't want to do because it benefits me in the end or it benefits others. So one of the most common questions is what chores to give to what child at what age and how to know when to start. My answer to that is your toddlers and preschoolers should be with you when you are doing almost all the chores. They are too little to really make a difference or handle any of the responsibility on their own, but bringing them alongside of you while you do the dishes and letting them help per se is setting the foundation for a 6-year-old that can handle the responsibility. So take them alongside of you and let them help with everything that you're doing. Don't shield them from all the workings of the home or the homestead, because in this way, they already know when they come to the age where they can do chores, they will already know all the effort that needs to be put in to keep the home and the homestead running. They will not wonder why we do laundry so often, because they all have been with you doing laundry, and they already know that it's just a fact of life that we must do laundry. It's not a surprise to them that the cow needs to be milked every day, because as long as they can remember, they have been going with you to the barn and they know the cow needs to be milked every day. So the pre-scholars and toddlers, and they need to go with you and be involved in the workings of the home and homestead. And then when they are ready for the responsibility on their own, they are not surprised or shocked that it needs to be done, because they already know that it takes a lot of work and effort to run a home or a homestead. So take advantage of those years of pre-scholars and toddlers when they want to be involved, because this is where you're going to set all the whole foundation for their childhood chores. Because when they're involved, you will be saying things like, here, all the socks go on this dirty laundry pile and all the shirts go on this pile. And even though they don't get it right every time, that does not mean that you're not training them. So when you're in the kitchen making supper, they will pull up a stool and you'll give them a spoon and let them stir. And while they're stirring, you'll be teaching them. You'll be saying, for this recipe, we need to whip the eggs very much. Here, use this tool. This is the proper tool for whipping eggs. So you're laying all the groundwork for them to dig right in at as young as 6 years old and take responsibility for some of those chores that they have been following you with for years. So in the back of my ebook, I have lists of chores for children of different ages. And you'll notice that the 2 to 4 year old list says supervised. So they're not really going to be responsible to do much of anything on their own. And that's not because you are too controlling to let them try. It's because you still need to do so much teaching on why. Why do all the socks go in this drawer? Because it helps us find our socks more easily when we want to go to town. You're still needing to do so much training at that age that you don't want to give them so much room to make mistakes and habits that you then have to correct. So that is why most of the chores on the 2 to 4 year old list says supervised chores. And then when you move up to the 5 to 9 year old list, you will see that they start being more responsible and being able to master some of the chores on that list, which means they can do them without a lot of direction or reminding. So one of the common questions I get is how to get the chores done where you don't have to remind them or correct them or, get them to take responsibility for doing the chores correctly. You'll have to remember you're working with children. You're working with children that have immature decision-making skills, and oftentimes they're still very impulsive. So there's going to be days when they skip through their chores because they want to go play with their siblings. That is normal, and very seldom with 5 children doing chores in the morning and getting off to school on time, very seldom do we have a morning where I don't have to call 1 or maybe even 2 children back to correct some of their chores. That is very normal, and you're not looking for perfection, you are training them. So when you train somebody, you expect that they need lots and lots of practice. And some children are going to need a lot more practice than others. And it doesn't make these children less valuable. It just means that their brains worked differently and they have different areas of interest. So maybe they are not really an animal person. So they're not going to be as intuitive with the animal chores as a child that really, really loves animals. And you can't change that. But with practice and lots of training, both children will be able to master the areas that aren't their first love or aren't their first interest. But you leave that room for growth, and you allow them that room for growth, and you expect them to make mistakes, because it just gives you a better idea of where they still need practice and training. So if you look at it as a whole picture, you are developing their character and their training for life, not just for this morning's chores. So if you keep that long-term goal of competent, functioning adults and character in mind, it helps you to have more of an overall view, instead of just the frustration of, we've had 2 mornings in a row where chores have not been done correctly. And believe me, I know the frustration, but that just gives you an idea of this child needs more practice in this area. And then you're more intentional about giving that child practice in that area in all day long, not just in that morning's chores. Because once you recognize that this child needs more practice in this area, and you are intentional about it, you will notice little pieces and places throughout the day where you can get that child to practice that same character trait, or that same chore, or you'll be able to notice where you can get them to focus on those details. So getting children to take responsibility for the chores that you have assigned them. One of the biggest pitfalls for me as a parent is when I go and double check their chores and I notice something's not right, then I go and tell them, hey, the chickens need water. I have picked up all responsibility for that chore now, and they no longer see it as their responsibility, because number one, mom's gonna check and she will tell me if I didn't do it right. So now I've picked up that chore and made it my own. So one of the ways that we work against me picking up responsibility for the chore is we do chore reports. So let's say my 10-year-old is in charge of feeding and watering the chickens and collecting the eggs. Now, we can't have the eggs stay out in the chicken house all day in the winter, because they will crack and freeze, and then we gotta throw them to the pigs. And my chickens can't be without food and water. And my 9-year-old is a 9-year-old, and I know him well enough that I know that on some days he might be distracted and not do his chores as thoroughly. So do I check up on it? Yes, I definitely peep in the chicken house. But does he know that I peep into the chicken house? No. So here's how it happens. We come to the house and I will ask for a chore report from the children. So I'll get my 9-year-old to come to me, and I don't say, did you feed the chickens? Did you water the chickens? I say, tell me what chores you have done. So then he will tell me something like, I checked their feed and it's over half full. I checked their water, and then oftentimes he'll be like, oh, I'll be right back, Mom. So getting them to walk through the steps of their chores will trigger them to be like, you know what, I didn't get the eggs. So that way they continue to take responsibility for the chore. So, okay, so let's say that I noticed that the eggs weren't all gathered, but he thinks he did. So then that would go something like this. So I fed the chickens, I watered the chickens, and I gathered the eggs. And then I will say something like, how many eggs did you get? And then I'll say, do you think you should go check again? Because that doesn't seem like a whole lot of eggs. And of course, the 9-year-old's gonna say, no, Mom, I'm sure that was all the eggs. And then I will say, well, I'd like for you to go check again just to make sure, because I already walked through the chicken house and I already saw some, you know, I already know that he missed some. But doing chore reports gives kind of a neutral ground for me to make sure that they do their chores properly without picking up the responsibility myself. So then we do the same, you know, like doing their hygiene before they go to school. Come and tell me what you've done to get your body ready for school. So then, because my 3 younger boys are 6 and 7 and 10, they will say, I brushed my hair. Oh, I forgot to brush my teeth. So it still stays, the chore still stays their responsibility. So whenever I find myself falling into that ditch of picking up the responsibility for chores, picking up that responsibility and making it mine, I resort to chore reports. The other time I really focus on chore reports is when I feel or when I see that a child has gotten real sloppy with their chores. And so then it gives the child a chance to correct their own mistake without me criticizing them. So you always want the child to notice their own mistake and fix it themselves, because it becomes their skill. When they make a mistake and they notice it and they fix it, it connects something in their brain where it sticks a lot better than if you notice the mistake and you point it out to them and they have to go fix it. So you always want to give that opportunity for the child to catch their own mistake and to fix it themselves. So chore reports helps put the responsibility back on the child, and it gives that opportunity for them to catch their mistake and fix it themselves. So what if you have a child that refuses to pick up responsibility or does not care about the mistakes they make? So this is where I step in as a parent. And I, of course, have given, you know, directions. And I've even resorted to saying, I have noticed that you aren't giving the puppies enough food. And remember how yesterday I told they need 2 cups of food, and now they're out again. Can you explain to me if you didn't give them enough food or if you forgot? So I give them many chances to correct a mistake and to correct their own mistakes. And if over and over again there is no growth in that area, all I'm looking for is growth, not perfection. I just want growth. And if I see that a child refuses to grow in this area, even with direction and teaching and encouragement, that's when we give consequences. So why do our children get consequences? Because with a few well-placed and timely consequences in a child's life, you can redirect and keep them from forming a habit that they would spend months and years working to correct as an adult. Because most of the decisions that our children make in everyday life don't have most of the bad choices they make, or less than stellar choices. Those choices don't have any immediate consequences, so they're not going to start connecting the dots. A lot of the little bad choices they make as children, you're not going to see the effects of until their adult life. So as a parent, if I can create some consequence for a bad choice and be consistent with that consequence, I might save them years of trying to break bad habits in their adult life. So a consequence for a child that refuses to grow and correct mistakes will often look like more chores in that same area so they can work on. And I will say something like, it seems to me like you need a lot more practice with being consistent in this area because the chickens have run out of food twice this week. So for the next week, you will not only be feeding the chickens, but you will also be feeding the pigs. So because seems like you need more practice in judging when to feed them and how much to feed them. And I will, of course, walk along and, I'll come alongside the child and explain things that I feel like maybe he's not understanding. So you want to give them every chance at success that you can. And so normally for our school-age children, the consequences first look like extra practice, which means more chores, which means less free time. So they eventually start making the connection that the better I am at my chores, the more free time I will have. So there you see the skill of work ethic starting to develop, because the better and the faster I do my chores, the more of a reward I will have. So if that consequence of extra practice does not work, then we will have the consequence of lost privileges. And for each child, that of course looks different, because whatever the child holds most dear or values most is definitely going to be, you lose screen time, or, you lose game time, or whatever it is that the child really, really wants, because they need to make that connection that the better I am at my chores and the faster I can check them off the list, the more time I will have to do what I really want to do. So you make it counteractive, and if they don't do their chores properly, or they're not, they don't complete them in a timely manner, then the natural consequence would be you have less time to do what you really want to do. So another question that I get quite often is, what if a child downright refuses to do a chore? Well, in our house, that looks like, you don't want to do your chores right now? Okay, well, you can sit here on this stool and let me know when you decide to do your chores, and then you can go do your chores, but you're not going to do anything else until this chore is done. So whatever that might look like in your home, the trick is to always have the same response and to be consistent. So they are in their mind, when they think, oh, I don't want to do chores and I'm going to tell mom no, they already know exactly what to expect. They already know that you're so consistent, they're not going to get away with it. And if you're not consistent, they're going to try it every day, because they're going to think, maybe today mom will say, okay, I'll do your chores for you. Or maybe today, if I throw a big enough fit, mom will get tired of it and let me slip without doing chores. So you have to be very intentional about what you decide for the consequence to be, and then you have to be able to stick with it. So consistently always responding the same way to a refusal to do chores. You just keep it very, very simple. You don't react, or I don't react. I just say, okay, that's not a problem. You can sit right here. But you have to remember that if I go to the barn now and you don't want to do your chores, you're still gonna have to go do them, and I won't even be out there. So you'll have to go to the barn by yourself. So for some children, it takes a lot of consistency. Others catch on after 2 or 3 mornings, and they're like, well, if I don't hustle, I'll have to be doing my chores out there by myself. But each child develops differently, and you meet them with where they're at, and you work with what you've got. Just because you have a 9-year-old that's never done chores before, you can't expect them to be doing the same chores that my 9-year-old is doing, who's had chores since he was 4 and 5 years old. You start with where the child is at. So that might look like your 9-year-old is required to help with the dishes every day. And so that might look like him standing next to you and rinsing the dishes when you wash. And then you'll build on that responsibility and give him more chores as those are mastered, and as he learns to take responsibility for little chores. It doesn't matter how old they are when you start with chores. You always start at the same place, with that foundation that we talked about with the 2 to 4-year-olds, introducing them to all the jobs that have to be done, And then once they have mastered that, and of course, if you have a 9-year-old, it's only going to take a week. Where if you have a 2-year-old, you're going to spend year 2, 3, and 4 getting them accustomed to everything that needs to be done around the home. A 9-year-old is probably going to catch on in a week and start noticing that, wow, this is all the things that need to be done. And then you can start assigning chores and then building on those skills as he develops them. So just because you're starting later doesn't mean that you're going to end up with less skills. You're just going to start at the very beginning and start laying that foundation. And your 9-year-old is going to pick up the skills a whole lot faster because he's already got the more brain capacity for picking up these skills. So one of the questions, another question that I get often is, how do you know when you've assigned too many chores? Or how do you know when it's too much? One of your children's biggest trick to getting out of chores is feigned incompetence, or they pretend something is too big or too hard for them and they can't do it. A child is very, very young when they discover that if I pretend I can't do it, the chore will be assigned to somebody else and I will not have to do it. I have seen that in children between 2 and 3 years old, where they pretend they can't do something because they don't want to. So your biggest weapon against feigned incompetence is consistency. And if after a week of working on the same chore, you don't see any growth, you're definitely going to have to back up and say, okay, my child is not at the point where he is capable of this chore, even though I thought he could. So then you don't take the chore away altogether. You just work alongside them and say, okay, I've decided that you and I are going to feed the dogs together because, you know, and you don't say this to the child, but you notice that the dogs are knocking the scoop out of his hand, and the food is just getting spilled too much. And this is actual real life experience for me. So you and I are going to feed the dogs together for a while, and I'm going to help you figure out a way that you can do this yourself. So you just work together and you figure out a way where this child can actually do this chore by himself, but it still becomes his responsibility. It just takes longer than you thought it would. So another incident is, I had a bag of cat food that needed to go to the barn, and I asked a child to take the bag of cat food to the barn, and it was a little too heavy for him, and he ended up dragging it to the barn, which he then spilled the cat food because the bag got a hole into it and there was cat food everywhere. And was I frustrated? Yes, I was mostly frustrated at myself because I didn't think through that this child would probably not ask for help because he was determined to do it himself, and that I would waste some expensive cat food. So there's definitely times when I've been like, oh, that chore was too much for that child. But as parents, as mothers especially, we tend to underestimate our children. So my advice when you're wondering if you've assigned too much is no, you probably didn't assign too much, but your expectations of time frame and when this skill will be mastered may have been, you may have had expectations that weren't appropriate. So is washing the family's breakfast dishes too big of a job for a 6-year-old? It depends on the 6-year-old. You have to know your 6-year-old and of course the size of the family. My 6-year-old could probably wash the dishes for the entire family, but he could probably not get them done before it's time to go to school because he would need more time. So I have to adjust my expectations. And the other thing is knowing your child's attention span. Washing the entire family's breakfast dishes is probably a 30-minute job. And I know my 6-year-old well enough that I know he's gonna become discouraged long before 30 minutes. So is he still required to wash some dishes? you know, because I've assigned him, this is your chore, but it's just not working. So this is probably what I would do in that situation. Actually, this is what I would do because it has happened in our home where I realized that this chore is not working for this child, but instead of taking it away, I have to come alongside of him and I have to pick up some of the responsibility, and I have to say, okay, if you wash all the cups and all the plates, then I will wash the rest of the dishes. And then once he's mastered doing the cups and the plates in a timely manner without getting discouraged, then I'll add a little more. And in that way, I'm encouraging him to grow without discouraging him with a chore that is too much. So the fine line is learning always expecting just a little more than your child thinks they can do. And in that way, you encourage growth. So if washing dishes is on the list for the 5 to 9-year-olds, that doesn't mean by the time your child is 6, he should have mastered washing all the family's dishes. That just means that washing dishes is going to be one of the skills that your child is working on, and that you're going to continue to expect him to grow in that skill as time goes on. He may master it in a month, where my 6-year-old might take 3, 4, 5 months to master that, because they are different people. So use the chore list as a guideline on what skills to be working on, and not so much we need to master this. Because all you're really looking for is growth in skills and in character. Another one of the things that children seem to be really good at is wanting to do the least amount of work that's possible. This is very normal, and it happens in my family with every child, and it seems most prevalent in certain age groups, like from age 7 through about 10 or 12, where they will rush through their chores and disappear to try to not be asked for more chores, or just to do the least amount possible. And when that happens with a younger child, I take note and I work on stretching and growing that child. First of all, you have to meet them where they're at. You have to find out their attention span. So maybe their attention span for a chore is just 5 minutes. Take that into consideration and expect only a little bit more with each chore. Instead of trying to stretch a child's attention span or what they think they're capable of, instead of trying to stretch it from that 5 minutes and expect 20 minutes of focus from them, just expect a little more each day or each week, if that is the rate at which your child develops skills. Don't expect them to grow by 10-minute attention span if all they're able to give you is 5. You just meet them where they're at and expect a little bit of growth at a time, because after all, you're not looking for chores checked off of a list. You are working on a lifetime's worth of self-discipline and life skills. That's what you're training for. You're not training just for washing dishes. You're training for a lifetime's worth of work ethic and success. One of the questions I get a lot is, do our children get allowances? No, our children do not get paid for their chores. They are part of the family team, and as part of the team, we all work together, and everybody has a time to serve and a time to be served. So, for example, when the children are little, so when we have infants, the whole family works together to do the things that the infant can't do. The little ones, their laundry needs to be folded by someone. And of course, the older children are capable, so they fold the laundry that belongs to the entire family. Whereas when those older children grow up and get jobs and their laundry gets done by the family, those same younger children now have to fold their older siblings' laundry. So there's a time to serve and a time to be served, And your payment for all your chores is you get delicious food on the table, and you have a bed to sleep in, and you have a roof over your head, and we all work together to provide all of those things for the entire family, because we are not raising children to be entitled to serve only themselves, but to know how to serve those that live with them, those that they love, and their surrounding communities. Would this homestead be possible without the help of our children? It absolutely would be. And part of the reason that we have this homestead is so that our children have chores. That is one of the number one reasons we are raising our own food. So one reason we have a large garden is because we need opportunity for our children to develop work ethic and the skills to be a blessing to their communities and those around them. So one of the questions that I do not think I have addressed yet is the whining and complaining about chores. And here again, you choose a consequence that fits the behavior, and then be consistent and be as simple and as straightforward as possible. So if whining and complaining happens about chores, then that child just needs more practice. So if you're whining about taking the garbage out, well, guess what? Your attitude was not appropriate. So when you come back in, I'm going to have more garbage for you to take out. And we will keep on practicing until you can do it with a respectful attitude. Now, I will often give my children a warning first. Like if I ask somebody to take the garbage out and they whine and complain, I'm like, that sounds like you need more practice. And they know what that means, because that means, oh dear, mom is going to give me more chores and I won't get to go play as soon as I thought I would. So once you've set consistent consequences for those types of behavior, all you really probably need to do is give a warning. Some children heed warnings immediately, and other children end up with more consequences because they just don't heed warnings, or they don't respect boundaries as much as other children. But the way to hit the whining and complaining about chores is just give more practice. If a child has a bad attitude about wiping dishes and putting them away, that just means they need more practice with doing it. So all you need to say is, your attitude is very disrespectful about this chore, so that you must need more practice. So you're going to, with an older child, the consequence doesn't have to be as immediate as with a younger child. So with somebody older than 10, I would likely say, well, you're going to wipe dishes for lunch too. And if your attitude's still not okay, then you're going to wipe dishes for supper as well. And the older child is able to connect that consequence with the choice that they made and start forming that connection and start growing in that area, where a younger child needs to have a consequence that's almost immediately after the action or the misbehavior, so that they can connect their behavior with the consequence. So for example, let's say my 6-year-old was asked to take a bucket of scraps to the pigs. He whines and complains. I will say, okay, bring it back, and now you're going to take, I might just put water in and say, now let's do it again and let's practice your attitude. And with a 6-year-old, I might even say, your face should look like this, and these are the words that I would like for you to say. And then, so let's say he complains about taking scraps out to the hogs. I'll say, okay, looks like you need more practice. When you come back in, come see me. Then I'll put water in. I'll say, okay, go dump that into the hog's dish and let's work on your attitude. And normally, once you've done that a couple of times, you only need to give a warning. Like, I understand that you don't want to do this, but that's no reason to be disrespectful about something that somebody is going to have to do. Another question that I get is how much free time versus how much chore time do your children have? So we have more chores than a lot of children, than a lot of families do, but we also have 5 children living here at home that we split the chores up among. So I feel like I barely have enough chores this time of year to keep my children busy. Now, do they have to be busy all the time? No. So in the morning, our chores take us about an hour combined. Like everybody is busy doing chores for about an hour or maybe 90 minutes. And then the rest of the day, so after school, we have a couple assigned chores, but mostly that is just them coming and help alongside whatever I'm working on that day. So like you've seen in previous videos, if we're deep cleaning, after school, they're going to be called to help deep clean. And does this mean that each child is working nonstop for the next 2 hours? No. It means that I'll call a child to me and say, hey, could you help me with this? And then I'll call another child and say, hey, can you help me with this? Each child needs a different amount of work to keep them busy and growing. So if things get chaotic and they cannot find something to play, and if there's fighting or if there's just unrest, it's usually a sign that my children need work, and I will decide on a project that we're going to do, and we're all going to focus and work together. I might give them a warning and say, hey, I have some work to do. If you guys can't settle in and play something nice, we're all going to go deep clean the upstairs. So how much work and how much free time, that is what only you can say how much work your children need. But as a whole, chores, like for my 13 and 15-year-old, they probably have, over the span of one day, they probably have about 2 hours worth of chores that they do. And some of them are routine chores that they do every day. And then others are like 10, 15-minute chores when they're helping make supper, or, you know, cleaning up after supper, or I might get them to mop the floor, things that don't need to be done every day, but somebody has to do them. So our children leave for school around 8 o'clock every morning. They get up at 6:15, and then all together we work on getting all the animals fed, the cow milked and the milk taken care of, and then we have breakfast, and breakfast gets all cleaned up and put away. Their lunches get packed, and the house gets put in order for the day. So I think that's all the questions I have time for today, and this is all written in my ebook that's available on my website, and in the back of the ebook are chore lists that give you ideas on what areas you could be working on with children of different ages. But this doesn't necessarily mean that children of those ages are going to master every one of those skills within that age group, because number one, it depends on how much exposure they have to that chore. Like a 10-year-old that hasn't been used to washing dishes is not going to master it as fast as an 8-year-old that has been practicing since he's 5 years old. So the chore lists are there to give you an idea on what skills you could be working on, and then how fast those skills are mastered depend completely on the child and your approach and your consistency to those chores. So thank you all for watching. I appreciate your comments, and I really appreciate everyone that has subscribed to our channel.